Hello, everybody. Welcome to both our in-house and our Zoom attendees. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shelby Brown, and I represent public programs at the Villa, and we are really glad to host our speaker today. John Lee is a professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Barbara, where he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on the ancient world. He's an expert on Greeks and Persians of about 650 to 330 BC, on the history of various militaries and of warfare, and on the reception and interpretation of antiquity. He's an accessible speaker. He's interested in outreach and in students. He's lectured about the Persian Empire for the Great Courses series of the Teaching Company, and he's given many public talks and published widely on many facets of the ancient world, especially Greece and Persia and military history. We were lucky to have him here this summer to speak at a Bacchus Uncorked wine program. And he talked to us about dining and drinking with Greeks and Persians. So we're really happy to have him back so quickly to speak about another of his interests, which is African American scholars of antiquity in the late 19th and 20th century. His book on John Wesley Gilbert, the first black archaeologist, was published this year by Oxford University Press. Without further ado, please welcome Professor John Lee.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Shelby, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to all the Getty staff who have made my visit possible here. It is a real honor and a real delight to be back here at the Getty Villa. If I seem a little star-struck, it's because I was surprised to find one of my college roommates were coming to the talk. I see some former students and some friends from Santa Barbara, as well as those of you who might be watching online. So thank you all so much for being here. It's really delightful to have a chance to talk in person with you a bit about my book. Now, I am not going to run through the extraordinary life of John Wesley Gilbert from his birth into slavery in 1863 until his death from illness in 1923, because otherwise there'd be no reason for you to go read the book. So what I will do instead is to sort of shine a spotlight on the research methods and the sources that I used to reconstruct Professor Gilbert's story. A story that, when I began my research more than 6 years ago, seemed like it was lost. So let's get started with a place that's actually not too far down the road. This is Phillips Chapel Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles, about 5 miles southeast of here. And in the fall of 1916, Phillips Chapel CME, as well as other institutions in Los Angeles, including USC, welcomed a speaker who had come all the way from Georgia. Tall, articulate, learned scholar. He spoke about his life, raised in poverty in Augusta, Georgia. He spoke about his education as one of the first few African Americans to attend Brown University, and as the first African American to go to Greece. And he spoke about his more recent endeavors as a missionary to the Belgian Congo. And that speaker, of course, was John Wesley Gilbert. And you can see him in the Belgian Congo with Bishop Walter Russell Lambeth of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, when the two men undertook their joint mission there in 1911, 1912. Now, into the 20th century, if John Wesley Gilbert was known for anything, it was above all for this mission to the Congo. It was a story that was recounted in the literature of both the CME Church and of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, or the MECS, which, by the way, is now part of the United Methodist Church. And that story continued on and was spread thanks to the work of the president of Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, who in 1961 wrote a book of men who ventured much and far. E. Clayton Calhoun was the president of Payne College. It was Payne College, that was John Wesley Gilbert's school. Gilbert had been the first student, one of the first 7 graduates, and the first black professor at Payne. And Calhoun was very interested in recovering Gilbert's life. And so Gilbert's work in the Congo, his work in the United States, his team effort with Bishop Lambeth, that remained known into the 20th century and even into the 21st century. But Gilbert's early life, and especially his work as an archaeologist in Greece at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens in 1890 to 1891, was much less well known when I began my work on this book around 2015. And you might ask, well, if he was so famous, if Gilbert was so well known, why do we not know, or why did we not know so much about that earlier portion of his life? And the answer is this: a tragic fire. On the night of August 3rd, 1968, the main building, Haygood Hall, of Payne College burned down. No one ever discovered what the reason was. The building had had boiler problems, electrical problems. It may have been an accident. But the result of this tragic fire was that many of the materials which a biographer or historian might have used to reconstruct Gilbert's early life were destroyed. And that's maybe where I come in, because as someone trained in ancient history, this kind of situation, no sources, is one that I was all too familiar with. In fact, in ancient history, we spend our time mostly trying to reconstruct past stories out of fragments. So this story appealed to me, and although I did not start out to write an entire book about Professor Gilbert, in the beginning I thought I would write a brief article. That's how naive I was. I found myself becoming absorbed by the story. As someone who grew up in Hawaii, who had lived in Asia, who now lives in California, African American history and the black experience in the South was something I had never really encountered, that I knew nothing about. So this project began as a way to educate myself. And along the way, I made new connections, I learned new things, and I learned the story of an entire community that I had never learned before. And during my trips to Augusta, I made friends. There are too many to name every single one here, but I would like to single out Dr. Mallory Millender, who is the historian of Payne College and a 1964 Payne College graduate, Ms. Alana Lewis, who preserved the last surviving bits of Payne's archives and brought what remained up to modern archival standards, keeping it available for researchers to come and consult one day, and that meant me. And Reverend Ashley Calhoun, who is the son of E. Clayton Calhoun, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. I've said this again and again in public talks. It's been given to me to tell the story of John Wesley Gilbert, his accomplishments, and the world in which he lived. But this story really belongs to Payne College and to the people of Augusta, Georgia. And I'm really just the messenger to tell the story and to spread it more broadly. And all that I accomplish in this book is dependent on the help, the advice, the friendship, the community of people I met along the way. And so with the aid of those friends, scholars, community members, I began to reconstruct the story. Now, in some respects, I benefited from what you might call the new technology of the 21st century. When E. Clayton Calhoun wrote his book, if you wanted to look at a newspaper, you had to have a physical copy. In 2015 and onward, I could look at digitized newspapers. I could look at out-of-copyright books on Google Books, or Hathi Trust, or archive.org, or many, many other sources. And through digital searching, I was able to uncover documents that otherwise I never would have known about. Most importantly, I was able to find Gilbert's own writing. And at the top left, or my left of the screen, you'll see one of those excerpts. This is an excerpt of a letter that Gilbert wrote from Greece. The original letter is now long gone. It was published in his hometown newspaper. That newspaper is also now long gone, but a fragment survives because it was reprinted in the New York Age, which was a nationally circulated African American newspaper. So digital searching was a key tool in my research, enabling me to find material that otherwise I might have had to page through thousands, tens of thousands of sheets of old newsprint to find. On the other hand, some of the other fragments I found were the result of good old-fashioned paper archival research. And I mentioned that Ms. Lewis had preserved what survived the fire, and these other three examples I show you on the screen came out of that preservation. A photocopy made in the 1970s of a reprint of a newspaper that no longer survives. So a second or third hand survival, Ms. Lewis preserved. The handwritten notes that E. Clayton Calhoun had taken when he was writing his 1961 book, preserving some of the only fragments we have of Gilbert's Congo diary. When President Calhoun had finished that book in 1961, he sent the original diary back to New York City to Professor Gilbert's oldest daughter, Alma. And when she died in 1980, the diary was lost. All we have are the fragments. And then the earliest known publication of John Wesley Gilbert, discovered in an Alabama attic in 2000. All that came with this in the Payne archives was a little piece of paper that said Mrs. Dickie L. Bridges. So I did a Google search, and I found Dickie L. Bridges had an Etsy account. So I signed up for Etsy. And I messaged Mrs. Dickie L. Bridges through Etsy. And she said, I found this newspaper. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for writing me. I couldn't bear to throw this away. I found this old newspaper in Alabama. I was cleaning out my folks' attic. They were inveterate antiques collectors, and I too love antiques, and I couldn't bear to throw it away. They probably got it in Nashville, but I just couldn't bear to get rid of this, and I found Payne College's address, and I mailed it to Payne College. And that's the only reason we have that document, thanks to Mrs. Bridges and her realization that this could be a priceless treasure for someone who was interested in that school's history. And she didn't know how priceless it was because the front page of this article is John Wesley Gilbert's, an essay he sent home from Brown University as a senior at Brown. It's the only way we would possibly have that. So it was through this kind of looking here and there, piecing together little bits, writing and asking questions, internet, digital searching, that I was able to bring this story together over the past 6 years. And so some of the themes. In the book, I trace Professor Gilbert's early life and education. Born into slavery, he was able to receive an education in Georgia through the public schools of Augusta, Georgia. And one point I highlight in those early chapters is the important role that black women teachers played in Gilbert's early education. If you look at the document on the left, which is his Freedmen's Savings Bank account register, the Freedmen's Bank was set up after the Civil War to help the newly freed people and others to build savings and plan for the future. Look at his occupation. Go to school to Miss Chestnut. I was able to find Miss Chestnut. She taught at a church school in Augusta. I was even able to track down a relative of hers who now lives in New York City, a descendant of Miss Chestnut. I was able to place Gilbert in primary school with one of the most famous women educators in Georgia, maybe even on a national level, Lucy Craft Laney. And I try to draw a case in the book that it may have been through Miss Laney, who was skilled in Latin by the time she was age 10, it may have been through Miss Laney that Gilbert first encountered the classical languages, Greek and Latin, that would become a defining part of his career. And then when Gilbert briefly went to Atlanta to study at Atlanta Baptist Seminary, which is the ancestor of today's Morehouse College, he spent part of the year living with the Easley family. And Isaac Easley was a blacksmith, but his daughter, pictured here, Elizabeth Easley, was one of the first 5 black women to teach in Atlanta public schools. And living with the Easleys for part of the year, Gilbert must have had conversations and drawn inspiration from Elizabeth Easley. Also, Elizabeth Easley eventually would marry Gilbert's Greek teacher in Atlanta, William Holmes. So my book takes the reader through the story of Gilbert's education and places him into the context of African American educational achievement after the Civil War. It's a truly extraordinary story of people who, as soon as they escaped bondage, rushed to obtain the best education that the United States could offer so they could claim their rightful place as citizens, as members of the American community. And I take that story through Gilbert's work in Atlanta and then his return to Augusta, where he became, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, the first student, one of the first 7 graduates, and the first black professor of Payne College. When he was there first, it was called Payne Institute until 1903. And I trace Gilbert's relationship with George Williams Walker, who was a white Methodist minister who served as the school's president for the first several decades of its existence, and who became a father figure to Gilbert. When Walker died, Gilbert wrote to Walker's widow and said, "I never loved any man as I loved him, and he was as close to a father as I ever had." These two worked together at Payne for decade after decade. And to tell the basics of Payne's story, I had to look further afield, because the catalogs of the school, the kinds of documents that tell the basics of the curriculum, what was being taught, the students, the day-to-day goings-on of the school, that fire had destroyed all but one. Payne only had one surviving catalog when I started. I was able to locate a couple of others. One is in the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library. You ask, why is that? Because Rutherford Hayes visited Payne in 1891, and he was given a souvenir copy, and he took it home to Ohio, which is why it survives. Another copy survives at Stanford from 1895, and you ask, why Stanford? Because in 1895, Gilbert took a train trip to San Francisco, and he must have taken a copy or two of his catalog along. That helps to explain why that copy ended up in Northern California. It was with Walker's help that Gilbert was able to go to Brown University and become the 3rd black graduate of Brown University. And I tried in my research to visit every place that Gilbert had gone. I was not able to visit the Congo. If I had been able to do so, I would have. But I tried to visit all the places he had been in the United States and to travel in his footsteps in Greece. And when I was working on Gilbert's 2 years at Brown University, from 1886 to 1888, I encountered a challenge, which was figuring out what his relationship had been with the other students at Brown. Brown had had 2 previous African-American graduates in the 1870s. But by the time Gilbert got there in 1886, the memory of those students had long passed amongst the student body. So what was Gilbert's relationship with the students when he arrived? There were no documents that would tell me about this. Even Gilbert's essay that survived on the front page of that newspaper was about the plays of Shakespeare and not about everyday life at Brown University. So I turned to a source that might seem, totally useless. The old school catalogs of Brown University, which listed students, hometown, room number. How could this be of any use? Well, I decided to look at the relationship between the different rooms in these old catalogs. This is actually his dorm, Hope College at Brown University. His room would have been, hope I can get the pointer to go right up there. And from that room, I was never able to go into the room because it's hard to get permission to visit student dorm rooms. But from the room, he most likely could have seen the church that he attended, which was an AME, or African Methodist Episcopal Church, just a couple of blocks to the northeast. And it didn't really matter that I hadn't been able to go into the dorm, because in 1957, the entire dorm had been gutted. And so the arrangement of rooms that Gilbert had experienced no longer existed. So I wrote Brown University Facilities Management. And I said, do you have any old plans of Hope College? And they said, of course we do. Here, have a plan from 1891. And what they showed was that when Gilbert was a student, there's his room, Hope College, room 45. The rooms on each floor were clustered like a quad around an individual staircase. So you would spend a lot of time seeing the students in your quad. And then I sat down with those old catalogs, and I just listed every student that lived in those rooms year over year over year. And here's what I found. From the 1870s up until 1886, students tended to live in those rooms year after year. Look at these lines. Sometimes there are brother or cousin pairs that live together. There was a lot of long-term residents. But the year that John Wesley Gilbert arrived, everyone else moved out. I think white flight is a good way to describe this, except for one transfer student and the next year 2 freshmen who stuck around. Now, I can't prove the exact reasons why these students left, but it is suggestive to show that some of the students at Brown University were very unhappy with Gilbert's presence on campus. But this kind of spreadsheet also shows another side of the story. The very same room, Hope College 45, there it is again, that had been Gilberts Room, in turn passed on to a brilliant young man from Nashville, Frank Trimble, who became the next African-American student of Brown after Gilbert. And Frank Trimble's roommate was John Hope, a younger contemporary of Gilbert's from Augusta, Georgia, later the first black president of Atlanta University, and so on after for about 20 years. In a way, John Wesley Gilbert's Hope College room, Hope 45, became the center of black student life at Brown University for several decades after he left. A story that was not recorded in any document, newspaper account, but looking at those old catalogs gave a new, fresh insight that I might never otherwise have discovered. And there's Gilbert in his senior class picture. I did actually take a moment when I visited Brown to sit in this spot and try to imagine Gilbert's life and his graduation and his return to Payne College as the first black professor, where he was hired in 1888. Now, while Gilbert had been at Brown, he had worked extensively with a man who is probably forgotten today by scholars of classics, but in his day was one of the most important scholars of Greek and Latin classics in the United States. That's Albert Harkness, and you can see his picture there walking on the Brown campus when John Wesley Gilbert was a student. Undergraduates didn't like Harkness. Some of the things that show up in the yearbook are things like sayings such as, "His jokes he has noted upon every page. They are awfully stale and moth-eaten with age." That was what the undergraduates thought about Harkness, but Gilbert liked Harkness, and the two worked closely together. I think that Gilbert appreciated Harkness's insistence on exact translation and his attention to detail, because Gilbert's own students would later remark that those were the qualities that Gilbert really instilled in his classrooms. And it was Albert Harkness who suggested to Gilbert that he consider a new school in Greece, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Now, today, the American School in Athens is internationally recognized as a center for research and teaching. There are a number of former American School students here, including one who was a student of mine at the American School in 2009. But in 1888, when John Wesley Gilbert graduated from Brown and was told by Albert Harkness, maybe you should consider going to Greece, the American School was a fledgling institution, had no money, had only recently gotten a permanent building. It did not have a permanent staff. Greece was very far away in the 1880s. It took several weeks just to get there. There was always the worry of cholera, and Athens was definitely not yet a tourist town. In telling this part of the story, I was able to turn to the archives of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And I think it's only recently that archaeologists, U.S. archaeologists, have begun to appreciate the need to tell the story of their own profession. And thankfully, the archivists in Athens have preserved and cared for and cataloged these documents so that that kind of study can take place. And so I can find a list of students for 1889-90, which includes John Wesley Gilbert's name. There he is, John W. Gilbert Brown, 1888. But wait a minute, you say. Didn't he go in 1890-91? Well, what I discovered through my research in the American schools archives is that students often made plans to go and then for one reason or another had to cancel at the last minute. The other students listed here called back to teach, returned to the US. Gilbert's reason for not going in 1889 is not given, but I also know that his first daughter was born early in 1890. And my suspicion is, as I present it in the book, that he did not go because his first child was about to arrive, and he didn't want to go abroad during that time. It was a good thing that Gilbert didn't go in 1889 because the cholera was there, the professor was terrible, only 2 students showed up, and so he was actually very fortunate not to have gone in 1889, 1890. But when he did go in the fall of 1890, he arrived in an Athens that was very different from the Athens that some of you might know from visits over the past years or maybe the past couple of decades. If you go to Athens today, it's a city of more than 3 million people. It experienced rapid growth in the 1920s, in the 1960s, and afterward. Athens today can seem chaotic, overwhelming, enormous. But the Athens that John Wesley Gilbert arrived in September 1890, had only 107,000 people. And much of the area to the south of the Acropolis, as you can see on this plan, which is today covered with houses, much of that area was still open ground. And the guidebooks, such as Baedeker's guidebook, which was in its first English edition in 1889, said, a stay in Athens is the best part of visiting Greece. Stay in Athens as long as you can. Spend the winter there, because in 1890, nobody went to Greece for the beaches. They went in the wintertime, when the weather was warmer than in Northern Europe or in North America. So in my book, what I try to do is take the reader back in time with John Wesley Gilbert to an Athens which is very, very different from the one that we imagine today, and to walk through the streets that he might have walked through on his way to visit the German Archaeological Institute or the French school, or to visit the house and church of a Greek reverend, Kalopothakis, Michael Dimitrios Kalopothakis, whose house and church were kind of a meeting place for all the American and English visitors who came to Athens. This, by the way, was probably one place where Gilbert practiced his modern Greek, because the sermons were often given in Greek, and the hymns, although they were Protestant hymns he would have known from back home, the hymns were all sung in Greek. And then he might walk home from church to the American school building and pass by the neighboring building, the British school. These buildings were so new. This map is from 1890. They're not even on the map. They hadn't made it onto the map. And if you have been to the American school today, you might start from downtown and what's today the marketplace. There's the Acropolis, the Areopagus, and Mars Hill. You might walk all the way out to what was then the very far outskirts of the city to get to the American school. A place so new that the roads were not paved when you got to the neighborhood. This is more or less what the school looked like when John Wesley Gilbert got there. Here it's still under construction, but when he arrived there was no wall or fence around it. There were olive trees in the backyard, but goats and dogs were roaming through the gardens of the school. And the architect who built the school said, one of the best things about this spot is that the view is spectacular, and we're going to have this view forever. Which, of course, if you've been to Athens, is very different now. This photograph I took the last time I was able to visit the American school before the pandemic, and that's more or less the same view, but in all directions, the growing city of Athens has blocked off that wonderful view. There were only 4 students with Gilbert that year. Carlton Brownson, if you know the Loeb translation of Xenophon's Anabasis, that's that Carlton Brownson who translated the work of Xenophon. Andrew Fossum grew up in Iowa. He spoke Norwegian at home. He was one of the very first Norwegian Americans to get a PhD. John Picard was from New Hampshire, and he had gone to Dartmouth College and then studied in Germany before coming to come into Athens, and it would be Picard and Gilbert who would become the closest of these 4 students. And then, because the American school did not have a permanent staff, there were 2 professors for just 4 students. Rufus Richardson of Dartmouth, a man who liked to go on hikes, he liked to walk, and eventually to bicycle around Greece, and Charles Waldstein, who was in origin a German Jewish New Yorker, but had an academic position at Cambridge University. Richardson spent the most time with the students as the annual director, as they called it in those days. Waldstein was only there after the middle of December, so he saw much less of Gilbert. Now, the official reports will tell you all that. All this can be found through the official reports, but the official reports also mentioned a Miss Potter and a Miss Harris. And I thought, who are they? So I went looking, and it turned out that John Picard came with his wife, with his mother-in-law, with his wife's cousin, and with a bridesmaid, all of whose presence in Athens was pretty much neglected by the official sources, but who are invaluable parts of the story, because during their year in Greece, both Caroline Garish and Edith Harris, the 2 figures at the center, wrote letters home to New Hampshire. And their relative in New Hampshire bundled them up and kept them in an attic in New Hampshire. And they survived for me to rediscover in 2016. And these letters give us an inside view of Gilbert's experiences in Greece that we would never get from an official source. Here, for example, is Edith's description of Thanksgiving dinner for Americans in Greece. To have that American Thanksgiving, they went to the Greek Protestant church, and Mrs. Kalopothakis, who was originally Canadian, had a turkey, believe it or not. She had found a turkey and a traditional American Thanksgiving dinner to celebrate with these expatriate Americans. And Edith even mentions the students from the American school, 3 in number, a Mr. Fossum, Mr. Bronson, and Mr. Gilbert, the last a Negro. They are quite pleasant. So it's through these letters that we get an inside view that no official source would ever give us. And one of the very meaningful parts of this book research was that in 2022, I was actually able to meet the great-granddaughter of John Picard. Gilbert himself had no grandchildren and no living descendants, as far as we've been able to find. I was able to speak with a grandnephew of Carleton Brownson, but I was able to meet Catherine Tentoff, the great-granddaughter of John Picard. And here she is holding the passport that John Picard carried with him in Greece in 1890, 1891. And she actually has more documents that I'm going to work on publishing for the American school. All right, so 4 students, Professor Richardson, waiting for Dr. Waldstein to arrive from Cambridge. What did the Americans do in Athens that year? Gilbert, as I show in my book, had probably expected to spend a lot of time in the library reading, but Richardson, as I mentioned, liked to hike. And his kind of motto was, we said, no stone unturned unless too big to allow it. And so for the entire fall, the Americans went around Athens with 2 books in hand. One was a copy of Pausanias, the Roman travel writer. Another was a copy of this new book, Mythology and Monuments of Ancient Athens, by a British classical scholar, Jane Harrison, which is just hot off the press. And those letters I mentioned earlier, they often talk about, everyone wants this book, Jane. In fact, Edith Harris says, often you hear the cry, where's Jane? Have you got Jane? So the Americans are walking the city looking for ancient monuments that Pausanias, the Roman travel writer, describes, and consulting the commentary and maps that Jane Harrison has in this hot off the presses new book. And they also went beyond the places that Jane mentioned, including on a trip, I'll pass that by for the moment, including on a trip into northeastern Attica, the rural territory northeast of the city of Athens. Now, once again, the official records basically mention that the Americans made this trip. And so to find out more about Gilbert's experience, I had to look for other sources. And I found such a source in the unlikely place, you might think, of the Norwegian American Historical Association archive in Northfield, Minnesota, where in 1937, an aging Andrew Fossum decided he would write down his experiences of a half century before. And he wrote down a detailed account of his time in Greece, including this trip, which enables us to see that in just 3 days, the American school group walked from Kifissia over the mountains to visit the battlefield of Marathon. They stayed at a Greek banker's house. They walked to the temple of Rhamnus, all the way over the Attic Mountains, stayed overnight in a village, visited the sanctuary of Amphiaraus, and made it home. About 65 miles in 3 days. Now, my students who've been to Greece know that the American school trips today are grueling, 8 hours, 10 hours a day on a bus. But nothing that we've done in the 20th century is like walking 65 miles a day. This was the kind of experience of Greece that John Wesley Gilbert had, one that was on the ground, that involved going on foot from place to place to see the latest excavations. The only one I want briefly to mention is the famous battlefield mound of Marathon, which you can see here in a picture taken a few years after Gilbert visited. The year that Gilbert was in Athens, this mound had just been identified as the burial mound of the Athenian soldiers who fell at Marathon in 490 BC. So Gilbert was really part of the first group of American scholars to visit this place after it had been securely identified as that burial mound. And it probably looked something like this when he saw it in the fall of 1890. Now, we also know that Gilbert wrote a thesis, a master's thesis, during his time in Athens. He wrote it in December, January, and February of 1890, 1891, because by then it had become too cold and too rainy for Richardson to say, hey, we're going to go walk and see some other ancient sites. So the students went to the library, and Gilbert wrote a thesis. Now, writing such a thesis was part of the regular work of the American school during the year. But back at Brown University, where Gilbert was enrolled as an MA student, writing that thesis also meant that he would get an advanced degree. So he would become, in 1891, the first African American to receive an advanced degree from Brown University. It's kind of a funny irony that had he been in person in Providence and written the thesis there, he probably would have qualified for a PhD degree from Brown, because Brown was just beginning to award PhD thesis, degrees for PhD theses. Now, here's a place that, despite my best efforts in digital searching, despite archival hunting, despite hoping for a chance find somewhere, that I've had no success. Although in my book, I try to reconstruct what this thesis was about. Gilbert's thesis must have been handwritten. He must have left a copy at the school. In Athens, there was a typewriter, but nobody liked to use it. So probably there was just one handwritten copy, and it appears to have been lost forever. But we know about it thanks to a letter that Gilbert wrote to William Sanders Scarborough, who in 1890 was perhaps the most famous African-American scholar of Greek and Roman classics. Scarborough published dozens and dozens of articles. He wrote the first Greek textbook written by an African American in 1881, First Lessons in Greek. He was nationally known by the time Gilbert went to Athens. And Scarborough mentions in an article that he published in 1891 that Gilbert had written him. Even while I write, says Scarborough, a letter lies before me from a young colored student, a graduate of Brown University, who is now taking a postgraduate course at the American School for Classical Studies. He is making an excellent record and will present a thesis in March on the demes of Athens. This is the first recorded mention of Gilbert's thesis research in Athens, and other variations of this title appear in the official records of the school. A deme is basically a neighborhood or a district of urban Athens. And although we don't have the text, maybe it will show up someday, we don't have the text of his thesis, we can tell that Gilbert was at the very forefront of research on Athenian topography and on the urban neighborhoods or districts of Athens. In fact, he was the first American to write about this topic, setting the standard or setting it in train scholarship that would continue up until the present day. And the relationship that Gilbert and Scarborough built would continue once Gilbert returned to the United States. They would meet several times. They would attend an archaeological conference in Philadelphia. Their lives would also intertwine as the years went by. And this letter must have been particularly meaningful to Scarborough because he had tried twice to go to the American school. He had been invited by the leaders of the American school to come as a scholar to Athens, but he could never find the money. He was never able to go. And I think a sign of how important this letter was that he mentions it, Scarborough mentions this letter in his autobiography written in the 1920s, even though it was a letter he had received 30-something years ago by that point. Now, we're getting to the last portion of our talk. If you think about the title of my book, well, where's the archaeology? Topography and walking the landscape of Athens, looking for remains with Pausanias in hand, those are also archaeology, even though the popular definition of archaeology might be about digging up stuff in the ground. At the end of February 1891, the Americans went to the village of Neapsara, which was the site of the ancient city of Eretria, about a day's journey north of Athens, and they did not encounter a very pleasant environment. It was cold and snowy. Most of the people of the village were away for the winter, and because there were a lot of tombs and cemeteries around the ancient site of Eretria, a lot of plundering had occurred. But Charles Waldstein, as I show in my book, wanted to go to Eretria because he was interested in an older style of archaeology. You might say he was looking for the goodies. Above all, it was the siren song of these small little funeral vases called lekithoi that attracted him. And Waldstein writes in his journal that he was looking for lekithoi. And I show this one in particular because this lekithos had been discovered at Eretria in 1888. John Wesley Gilbert had seen this lekithos in the museum in Athens during the winter of 1890, 1891, and both Gilbert and Waldstein knew that Eugenie Sellers, the first British woman student of the next-door British school, that she was working on this. So the fact that there was this beautiful lekithos from Eretria, actually one of 3 different painted lekithoi, was one of the calls that drew Charles Waldstein to excavate at the city of Eretria. And I'll come back to that too maybe at the end. Waldstein's method, you might say, was not archaeology. It was not scientific archaeology as we would think of it today. It was basically treasure hunting. He would go to a place, look for remains on the surface, set his workmen digging and digging and digging, picking away, find the pretty stuff, pick it up. Oftentimes, the local property owner was able to get a share of what was found, and then Waldstein would have the rest sent back to Athens. And it was during this kind of digging that Waldstein uncovered what he would later identify as the Tomb of Aristotle. And one of the things I was able to do in my research was to correlate Waldstein's very detailed diary entries, day-by-day entries, with the photographs of the excavation that are preserved in the American Schools archive. So when he says, we all stood about and helped, had to take away 3 layers of large poros stone, most exciting, saw gold appear. You can see his archaeological style. Look at those 3 blocks, these blocks here. That's a good candidate for these large layers of poros stone that they were hacking away to get down into the graves, which in this case, sadly, contained only a small number of things. Amongst them, an inscription that could be restored to say, Biote, the daughter of Aristotle, Biote Aristotelu, and a set of metal styluses, including one here that he dubbed the pen, and a little statuette of the philosopher. And on this slender evidence, Charles Waldstein decided that this must have been the family tomb of Aristotle, and that somewhere in there was buried Aristotle, the philosopher. I cannot resist the story about this little piece, because when the stuff was sent back to Athens, part of it was broken along the way. And when the king of Greece saw this displayed in the museum in Athens, he joked to Waldstein, "I think you found Aristotle's toothpick." Waldstein was not happy about that. So Gilbert took part in this excavation, and you might ask, well, how could you possibly, from such slender threads, retrieve the Tomb of Aristotle? It is important to remember that just less than 2 months before Waldstein and the Americans went to Eretria, the Constitution of Athens, a lost papyrus document giving a description of the Athenian government from the 4th century BC, had been rediscovered in the British Museum. So if the British Museum could discover a lost papyrus of Aristotle, surely Charles Waldstein could rediscover the tomb of Aristotle in his excavations at Eretria. Knowing that this important papyrus had just been rediscovered helps to give a little bit more context to Waldstein's flight of fancy. For Gilbert's story, though, it had the effect of overshadowing the much more valuable and much more important contributions of John Wesley Gilbert at Eretria. But archaeology is not just about digging and finding tombs of Aristotle or otherwise, but it's about survey, about carefully walking the landscape, looking for signs of habitation on the surface, and recording those things. And Gilbert himself describes that process in a letter that he sent home to a newspaper in New York. Less exciting, though no less important, is tracing and measuring the city walls, noting their towers, peculiarities of construction, character and quality of the stones, and mapping everything of archaeological significance. Unlike Waldstein's treasure hunting, this work, and you can see Gilbert here and his partner John Picard here, and a Greek workman, this was scientific archaeology. It was one of the very first surveys that Americans ever conducted in Greece, and it set the standard for everything that was to follow in the late 19th centuries and into the 20th century. These walls here, by the way, no longer exist today. It's only thanks to Gilbert and Picard's survey that we can get an idea of what the southeast gate was like. To do their work, Gilbert and Picard used the metric system. It's hard for us to believe today, but in 1891, it was expected that the United States would soon follow the global move to a new international standard and use the metric system. So they used the metric system, and Gilbert was responsible for all the measurements that occur in that survey. And if you look at the survey publication, the accuracy of those measurements is clear. And this is an example of the type of surveyor's chain that Gilbert might have used as part of his work. There were tape measures in 1891, but they were either very stretchy or too expensive, and the surveyor's chain, which had been used for more than 100 years, was a very common and very reliable measurement system. And Gilbert and Picard together used scientific equipment. Here, by the way, is the theater of Eretria that Andrew Fossum spent most of his time excavating. There's Waldstein, Richardson, Picard. Way in the background is Vasilios Leonardos, who was the Greek official responsible for supervising, making sure the Americans didn't mess anything up too much. But if we zoom in on Picard, you can see a scientific instrument. The curator of scientific instruments collection at Harvard helped me out. She identified this as a device called an alt-azimuth theodolite, which is a surveying instrument which is optimized for measuring elevations and calculating angles. And the work that Gilbert and Picard did with this theodolite shows up in their careful survey of Eretria, and also in all the elevations taken on the excavation plan of the theater. And you might ask, where is Gilbert in this photo? My guess is that he is holding the surveyor's rod, because he and Picard have been working together on exactly this process for the past several weeks. So the Tomb of Aristotle might get the press, and we might think of archaeology as survey, in that Gilbert's contribution using the latest equipment, the latest scientific methods, really put him at the forefront of American archaeology in 1891. Here are just a couple more pictures, as I think I'm coming to the end of my time. The archives of the American School preserve the original map. Here's the published map. If you ask the Swiss and Greek archaeologists who work at Eretria today, they will tell you that this publication remains valuable because it preserves material that otherwise would not be known about. That's been dragged away, lost, covered over in the course of time. But again, I cannot resist showing some of the little touches that the original hand-drawn map has. If you look here and I enlarge it a bit, it says dormitory and salle à manger. Those are the two abandoned houses that the Americans were living in. 6 of them crowded into this tiny one-room dormitory and eating their meals in a roofless house on the other side of the block. One last Eretria picture from 1891. When I was in the last stages of writing the book, I had to select pictures, and I sent an email to Natalia Vogaikov-Brogan, the archivist of the American School. And Natalia had helped me since the very beginning of this project, back when I first thought I was just going to write an article. And I said, Natalia, do you have any landscape photos of Athens around 1890? Because I need something like that for my book. And she said, okay, I don't know, I'll go look. We've got a big file of landscape photos. And she came back 3 days later, and she said, I did not find any landscape photos, but I found this. This is John Wesley Gilbert and John Picard surveying the harbor of Eretria. It's in fact right there at this, what they identify as the small harbor. Sometime after 1891, you see the cross-out numbers, it had been recatalogued and put in the wrong file. And between 1891 and 2021, it had been lost. But Natalia found it, and it went into my book 3 days before it went into press. So you get to see that in the book. And just imagine what else is out there to tell the story of Gilbert or of other African American scholars whose work in the United States and elsewhere is less known. It's always possible that there's more information. So let me take this back to a close, and then I can stop and let folks ask questions. There's a beautiful picture, a drone picture of Eretria today, and you can see the walls that Gilbert and Picard surveyed. In fact, that's the tower, I think, that appears on the cover of the book. But if we think about Gilbert's legacy as a pioneer in African American education, as a leader of his community and of his church, as a contributor in all sorts of different ways, as a loving and kind father. He had 4 children, one of whom died tragically very, very young. It's an inspiring and impressive story, and maybe the most important part of his legacy we can take from this photo is the students that he taught at Payne College over a teaching career of several decades, and they include people such as Channing Tobias, who would go on to be a national leader of the NAACP, and Professor Emma Gray, who taught English at Payne College. If any of you know the work of Frank Yerby, the best-selling African-American author who was a Payne College graduate, it was Emma Gray who was Frank Yerby's college English professor. And in the same way, we might ask ourselves, if we're going to look at Gilbert as an inspiring, as an educational story, what can we do with students in the future? And I want to end with a couple of possibilities. If you are, or if you know, an educator who works with young students, middle school, high school students, and you're interested in going to Greece, the American School offers a fellowship, the Scarborough Fellowship, which provides opportunities for such teachers. I don't know if Dr. Cox, Don, are you in the audience in person? Dr. Dawn Cox of the Linwood School District is such a Scarborough Fellowship winner, and these photographs show what she was able to accomplish with her students, having them excavate planters on the school campus and to present and publish, you might say, their results. Here are students in Augusta, Georgia, that when I went to speak at their middle school, A.R. Johnson Health Science and Engineering Magnet Middle School. It is possible that one of these students may someday be, I don't know, the director of the Getty Villa Museum, right? And it's up to all of us to go beyond looking at the past and honoring Gilbert to think, what can we do now? How can we educate a future generation? How can we make such opportunities available for all? Something for all of us to think about. But for now, I want to thank you all, whether you're here in person or you're listening and watching online. Thank you so much for your attention and for taking the time to be here with me today. So thank you.
For those of you who would like to ask questions in the audience here, there's a mic right down here in front. And we also can hand deliver one to you from the other side. And for those of you online, there are a few questions coming in, and I will be popping up with them orally from my laptop in a few moments. I wanted to ask John a question about the proceeds of his book.
Thank you for reminding me. As I mentioned in the dedication page to this book, academic books do not sell a lot of copies, but any royalties that do arrive from this book will go to both to Payne College and to the Scarborough Fund of the American School that I mentioned.
I wanted to say that because he's promoting his book, and it's for a really good reason.
You'll have to say something about how we know each other.
Professor Lee was my advisor for my senior honors thesis at UC Santa Barbara a decade and a half ago. So this is very exciting to be here. And thank you so much. I did have a question. I noted that Picard was named as the author of the topographical survey published in 1891. Were there factors that prohibited Gilbert from also being named as an author at that time?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question, Brittany. So Gilbert had to leave earlier in the year than Picard. Gilbert left Greece around the beginning of April after he had done a tour of the Peloponnesus and then had to return to Augusta. And I argue in the book that most likely he did that because he had another child on the way. And his son, John Jr., was born at the end of April, and I think Gilbert got home just a few days before that. And after that, Picard was still in Greece, and he appears to have completed the manuscript there in Greece and then sent it for publication. So Gilbert's name does not appear as an author, but if you look at the very first footnote, after I quoted the part about the chain measuring, there's a line of acknowledgments, and Picard thanks Gilbert first, and then he thanks the other students, and only at the very end does he thank the professors, and even Wilhelm Dörpfeld. So I think there's pretty clear evidence that Picard and Gilbert had a good working relationship. And even though Gilbert's name is not on the article, it's on the map, and it's listed there on the map. But then I think that's a result of Picard being in Greece later and Gilbert having to go home earlier on. Just like in class, nobody wants to come up to the microphone, right?
It's easier online.
It is, and you have the anonymity, right? Yeah, that's...
I have a question I'll throw in, just wait 1 second, about your research. And a number of people have commented on how interesting it is to watch how your research unfolded. This is a question about whether you ever had to backtrack and go over the same archive twice, and how you managed to budget your time when you're trying to do all this hopping around and traveling and so on. This is obviously a budding travel writer.
Boy, that is a good question. I did have to backtrack because in the beginning, I thought, okay, it's a short article, so I sometimes would go to look at things very quickly and not realize that I might need the entirety of a document. So for example, the first time I went to Payne College, I only took photographs of portions of the surviving trustees' minutes. But the second time I went, I took the entire thing. And I did that partly because it's a preservation measure. So if there's no other digital copy, now I've made a digital copy. So I did backtrack in that sense. I should also mention I had 2 children during the time of this work, so a lot of my... and then there was a pandemic, right? A lot of my research took place by distance. And if you look at the acknowledgments in my book, you'll see 2 pages of people. And that's because every single one of those people replied with helpful, rapid, insightful assistance when I needed help. Whether it was the Brown University Facilities Management does not get a lot of questions from researchers. But whether it was Brown, the archivists of a number of different HBCUs, archivists in Switzerland, archivists in the United Kingdom, teeny little church archives across the US, people were very, very, very helpful. So this book is built on their research, and I should also mention to this question, timing. So I went to Athens before the pandemic. I had a lot done before the pandemic. I was stuck at home with 3 young children, and my wife and I both trying to write full-time jobs. We were lucky in that by the time I was coming to the end, that many archives had reopened, and I could get documents. And I'm aware that there are scholars who still face that challenge, that the pandemic threw a wrench in their work, and their timing was not, they were not as fortunate as I was. So yeah, there was a lot of going back.
John, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the talk. I also am a student who had the pleasure of working with Dr. Lee in Athens studying archaeology in 2009. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, to what degree or in what way was it valuable for you in reconstructing Gilbert's story to actually sort of walk in his footsteps, to be in the same places he had been? And likewise, does Gilbert talk at all in his writings about the value of sort of walking in the footsteps of the ancient Greeks in the places they had actually inhabited and lived?
Thank you for that question, Kyle. And I should point out that both Kyle and I are from Hawaii, so we share another connection. And it was very valuable to go not only in Greece, but to walk, for example, in Augusta, Georgia, down the streets that John Wesley Gilbert had walked as a young boy, because it let me see just the spatial arrangement of the place, where his house was compared to the church that he attended, where his house was compared to the railroad. Those things helped me appreciate his physical world. Going to Greece helped me appreciate how much had changed since he was there and the time I spent there. I didn't go to Greece for the first time until 1996. So I was able, through walking virtually in his footsteps, to kind of see the historical change that had occurred. At the same time, some of the places that he visited in Greece are the same places that I visited, that you visited. The main reading room of the American School Library. You probably wrote a report there, right? I wrote my first scholarly article there. That is the room that he wrote his master's thesis there. Now, there's a certain sort of value in kind of appreciating that, the meaningfulness of place. Gilbert himself does not explicitly say, by going here we're walking into the past. But in the preserved fragment that I showed you at the start of today, he actually takes his readers back in Augusta, Georgia, on a tour of the Acropolis. And he does this in a very beautiful literary style. When he gets to the foot of the Acropolis and starts walking up, he says, "Let us go upon the Acropolis. We climb up 100 feet or more. We pass through this gate as we go on the left, as we go on the right." In doing that, I think he very consciously wanted to take the readers back home on that journey with him, so that they would be walking in his footsteps as well. So in that respect, he certainly understood the value of place. And in that surviving excerpt, he shows it. And if I can just continue for one more point, not just classical, but also Christian remains in Athens, because the place that he most deeply responds to in that excerpt is not the Acropolis, but it's the Areopagus. And he says, "I went up to in the northwest of the Areopagus, or of the Acropolis, is Mars Hill, where St. Paul made his famous speech. I tried to find the very spot where he stood, and looking around, and then I carved the names of myself and my wife. And when I was in Athens, I looked for that inscription, but there are many hundreds of inscriptions. But it's possible that someday someone will find John Wesley Gilbert and Osceola Gilbert written as an inscription on the Areopagus, alongside those many, many hundreds of other travelers' inscriptions." So yeah, the power of place, I think he recognized.
There's another online question preceded by a comment about how your book will probably interest more in the history of blacks in these elitist professions of antiquity, which would be a good thing. And the question is how Gilbert was experienced by those around him in Athens, from his American colleagues to German and French archaeologists to the Athenians themselves, who would not have been familiar with black colleagues like him.
Yes, that's reactions from Greeks, reactions from Americans, and reactions from Europeans. I don't have direct evidence of Gilbert saying, and this is the experience I had, but I have many, many, many records of African Americans who traveled to Europe and to Greece during this time. And uniformly what they say is it's an experience of being treated equally, with respect, with consideration, and as any other person. The journalist Ida B. Wells has a fantastic quote that I put in my book, where she said, "I landed at Liverpool. It is like being born into another world. You can go into any conveyance, any house, any restaurant, anywhere, and be treated with the courtesy that you would just receive as a person. And this was an experience that occurred to African American travelers all throughout Europe. One traveler who visited Greece even says, people here do not see many black people, so they kind of go crazy over you. And we even know that there was a small expatriate African and African American community. And it's actually something that I would like to pursue further is African immigrants in Greece in the 19th century, because it was a small amount of information. So that's on the Greek side. Europeans, we know that Gilbert and the other students went to listen to Wilhelm Dörpfeld speak for 4 hours at a time, auf Deutsch. And that's probably one reason why Gilbert later taught German, because he had a lot of German practice, and they seem to have been accepted by the other international scholars as other members of that community. There is a record of a racist response from Charles Waldstein, which he mentions in his diary privately. But what's clear from his diary also is that Waldstein met with Fossum, he met with Picard, he met with Carlton Brownson, but only after Gilbert had produced his thesis and presented it did Waldstein meet with Gilbert. And I think he just had to acknowledge at that point that Gilbert had produced professional work and had to be recognized as a scholarly equal. And I go into that in some length in my book. So there was a reaction from Charles Waldstein, into which context we also have to consider Waldstein as an expatriate American. He's Jewish, he's living in the United Kingdom. He had his whole own set of challenges to deal with. But thank you for that question. That's a great question.
Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to ask a final question? There's one in the back.
I was wondering if you have any advice for libraries and archives that want to do a better job of making resources available for Black history and historians that want to tell some of those stories.
That's a great question. For this, you meaning for school libraries and archives? I was just talking with some of the actually with a college friend actually about the need for a children's book version of John Wesley Gilbert. So that doesn't exist yet, I would say. There is a booklet produced and an exhibition produced by Michelle Valerie Ronick. It used to be called 12 Black Classicists, now it's called 14 Black Classicists, and it gives the biographies of Gilbert and a number of his contemporaries who all made contributions in scholarship in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that would be accessible and short and available to students, I think, of even of middle school grade levels. Another book that would really be interesting is William Sanders Scarborough's autobiography, which was published in 1924, because Scarborough went from born into slavery, educated in Macon, Georgia, went from these very humble beginnings to basically see every big intellectual development in classics up until the 1920s. And it's a really powerful story of a journey from slavery to scholarship. And I think that's also accessible to a student audience. But you're making me think, like, what else would I assign? I will have to think about that. And actually, if you want to afterwards give me your email address, I will do the research on that, and I will find some things that I think would be worth sharing. So thank you. That's a terrific question.
I'm going to throw in just a couple more online ones, and then we're going to ease out into the sunlight. There's a question about whether Gilbert continued to write about and stay interested in archaeology as distinct from languages throughout his professional career.
Yes, this is an important question, the extent to which he stayed invested in archaeology. He never went back to Greece, and he did not participate in other archaeological projects, but I think it's likely that he taught archaeology as part of his history classes and his language classes, both of which he taught language and history at Payne College almost until he was too ill to keep going. And so there would have been some archaeology and art in those classes. So he had that interest. In 1901, he and Scarborough went to Philadelphia to the convention of the Archaeological Institute of America, and they were interviewed by I can't remember the particular name of the recorder. It's the AME Journal, the African Methodist Episcopal Church Journal, which called them both very interested in archaeology. So they were both interested. But after about 1905, and this is a story I tell in my book, Gilbert really had to refocus on raising money for Payne College. because the school began to suffer financial problems, the withdrawal of support from the white Methodists who had supported it. And so much of his energy was refocused on that. In fact, I started today talking about his visit to Santa Monica. Probably what he was doing was fundraising. And he had gone all the way up to San Jose. He came back down here. He was in Phoenix. He came all the way out on the train so that he could talk to different congregations and raise money to help keep Payne going. So he was not a lifelong archaeologist in the sense that it became his central occupation, but for a long time it remained a part of his world.
And then the last question, unless there's another one from the audience, relates to that. How was he able to afford his trip to Greece, especially given what you just said?
Thank you for reminding me about that. So I mentioned that William Sanders Scarborough was invited twice but could never afford it. There was another African-American scholar, Wiley Lane, who was a brilliant young Greek scholar at Howard University. Wiley Lane actually got funding from the federal government. A Massachusetts senator wrote it into the federal budget because Wiley Lane had powerful friends, but he died of pneumonia before he could go to Greece. And Gilbert was able to go to Greece because he got funding from Brown, from his teacher, Albert Harkness. And it was Harkness who really went the extra distance to ensure that Gilbert got the graduate funding. And I also know that Payne gave him a little bit of money as well. They gave him basically sabbatical pay, you might call it, because George Williams Walker, his mentor and colleague, realized that having Gilbert go to Greece would raise the profile of Payne, would increase Gilbert's ability to teach, would make him even more distinguished at the school. But if we want to ask where the money came from, it's Albert Harkness and Brown University, yeah.
I would like to invite everybody to thank John Lee very much for this talk.
Thank you.